Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Maybe you've had a long day, or maybe you just like falling asleep while thinking about distant voyages across moonlit seas. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter as if the gentle swells of the ocean have begun to rock you toward sleep. Tonight we drift back in time, across more than a century, to the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, where the greatest ship ever built met her fate on a calm, starlit night. This is the story of the RMS Titanic, a vessel that embodied the pinnacle of human ambition and engineering, a floating palace that promised to conquer the ocean itself. It is a story of dreams and hubris, of heroism and tragedy, of a single night in April 1912 that changed maritime history forever and continues to haunt our collective imagination to this day. So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, and let us begin this voyage together into the deep and quiet waters of history. The story of the Titanic begins not on the night she sank, but years earlier, in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of shipping magnates who dreamed of conquering the Atlantic Ocean. At the dawn of the 20th century, the transatlantic crossing was the great commercial prize of the shipping industry. Millions of emigrants sought passage from Europe to the shores of America, while the wealthy elite demanded ever more luxurious accommodations for their journeys between the Old World and the New. The competition was fierce. The German lines, Norddeutscher Lloyd and Hamburg America, had seized the prestigious Blue Riband, the unofficial award for the fastest Atlantic crossing. Their sleek, powerful vessels cut through the waves at speeds that left the older British liners in their wake. The British shipping companies, once the unquestioned masters of the sea, found themselves scrambling to respond. The Cunard Line, that venerable institution of British maritime supremacy, answered the German challenge with two revolutionary vessels, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, launched in 1907. These magnificent ships, powered by the new Parsons steam turbine technology, could sustain speeds of over 25 knots, fast enough to reclaim the Blue Riband for Britain. They were sleek, powerful, and unmistakably designed for speed. But the White Star Line, Cunard's great rival, chose a different path. Rather than compete in a race for speed, White Star would compete in the realm of size and luxury. The man who would orchestrate this vision was Joseph Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line and son of its founder, Thomas Henry Ismay. In the summer of 1907, Ismay dined at the London home of Lord William James Pirrie, the chairman of the great Belfast shipbuilding firm Harland & Wolff. Over dinner, the two men sketched out an audacious plan. They would build three enormous vessels, the largest moving objects ever created by human hands, ships so vast and so magnificent that they would redefine what it meant to cross the Atlantic Ocean. These ships would not merely transport passengers from one shore to another. They would provide an experience so luxurious, so comfortable, that the journey itself would become the destination. The wealthy passengers who crossed on these vessels would want for nothing. They would dine in splendor, exercise in fully equipped gymnasiums, swim in heated pools, and stroll promenades that rivaled the finest boulevards of Paris. Lord Pirrie was the perfect partner for such an ambitious undertaking. Born in Quebec but raised in Ireland, he had risen through the ranks at Harland & Wolff to become its chairman, transforming the Belfast shipyard into the largest and most advanced shipbuilding facility in the world. He was a man who thought in terms of decades and empires, who understood that the future of shipping lay not in incremental improvements but in revolutionary leaps of imagination. The financial backing for this grand vision would come from an unlikely source. In 1902, the American financier John Pierpont Morgan had assembled a consortium called the International Mercantile Marine Company, which had acquired the White Star Line along with several other shipping companies. Morgan's trust controlled a vast fleet of vessels and held ambitions to dominate the transatlantic trade. The three great ships that Ismay and Pirrie envisioned would be the crown jewels of this maritime empire. The ships would be known as the Olympic class, named after the first of the trio to be built. Olympic would be followed by Titanic, and finally by a third vessel initially called Gigantic, though after the disaster she would be renamed Britannic. Each name evoked the ancient Greek titans and gods, beings of immense power who bestrode the world like colossi. The names were not chosen carelessly. They proclaimed the ambition of their creators to build vessels that would dominate the seas as the Titans had once dominated the heavens. The design work began in earnest, overseen by a remarkable team of naval architects and engineers. Thomas Andrews, Lord Pirrie's nephew and the managing director of the design department at Harland & Wolff, would become the chief designer of the Olympic-class vessels. Andrews was a brilliant engineer who had started at the shipyard as an apprentice at the age of 16, working his way up through every department to gain intimate knowledge of every aspect of ship construction. He was beloved by his workers for his humility and his habit of wandering the shipyard floor, speaking with the men who hammered the rivets and fitted the plates. Alexander Carlisle, the general manager of Harland & Wolff, contributed significantly to the early design work, including the original plans for the lifeboat arrangements. Edward Wilding, the chief naval architect, performed the complex calculations that would ensure the vessels remained stable and seaworthy despite their unprecedented size. The design that emerged from their collaboration was revolutionary in its scale. Each ship would stretch nearly 900 feet in length, longer than 4 city blocks laid end to end. They would rise 11 stories from keel to funnel top, with tonnage exceeding 45,000 gross register tons. No moving object built by human hands had ever approached such dimensions. But size alone would not distinguish these vessels. Every detail was considered, every space designed to provide the maximum comfort and elegance. The first-class accommodations would rival the finest hotels in Europe, with private promenades, sumptuous dining saloons, and cabins decorated in styles ranging from Georgian to Queen and to Louis XV. The second-class spaces would exceed the first-class standards of most competing lines. Even the third-class accommodations, designed primarily for emigrants seeking new lives in America, would represent a significant improvement over the cramped and unsanitary conditions that had characterized steerage travel for generations. The technology that would power these floating cities was equally impressive. The Olympic-class vessels would be propelled by a combination of reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine, driving 3 enormous propellers. 29 boilers, heated by 159 furnaces consuming 600 tons of coal each day, would generate the steam that would push these massive vessels through the water at speeds exceeding 20 knots. And then there were the safety features. The hull would be divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by 15 bulkheads equipped with doors that could be closed automatically from the bridge at the pull of a single lever. The designers calculated that the ship could remain afloat with any 2 compartments flooded, or even with the first 4 compartments flooded simultaneously. Such an eventuality was considered almost inconceivable, a worst-case scenario that would require the most catastrophic of collisions. The press, seizing upon these technical specifications, began to describe the vessels as practically unsinkable. In the early years of the project, as the designs were finalized and the contracts were signed, no one could have imagined that this phrase would become a bitter irony, a testament to the limits of human confidence in the face of nature's indifferent power. The men who conceived the Titanic believed they were building something that would endure, a monument to human achievement that would sail the Atlantic for decades to come. They poured their finest efforts into her construction, their most advanced technology, their most ambitious dreams. The Titanic was never designed to be the fastest ship on the sea. She was designed to be the largest, the most luxurious, the most comfortable. She was designed to be an experience, a floating palace that would transport her passengers not merely across the ocean but into a world of elegance and refinement that few of them could experience on land. She represented the apex of an age of confidence, a world that believed in the inevitability of progress, in the capacity of human ingenuity to overcome any obstacle. That confidence would be tested on a cold April night, in the darkness of the North Atlantic, when the greatest ship in the world met a mountain of ice drifting silently through the black water. But before that fateful encounter, the Titanic had to be built, and her construction would be a story of ambition and industry, of thousands of workers laboring for years to transform blueprints and dreams into cold steel and gleaming brass. The Harland and Wolff shipyard occupied Queen's Island, a peninsula of reclaimed land jutting into Belfast Lough on the coast of what was then the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. By the early 20th century, this shipyard had become the largest and most advanced shipbuilding facility in the world, a cathedral of industry where iron and steel were transformed into the vessels that carried humanity across the seas. To build the Olympic and Titanic simultaneously, Harland and Wolff undertook a massive expansion of their facilities. The existing slipways were inadequate for vessels of such unprecedented size, so the shipyard demolished 3 smaller slipways and constructed 2 new ones, side by side, capable of accommodating the enormous hulls that would take shape upon them. A new fitting-out wharf was built, along with a Thompson graving dock that could hold vessels up to nearly 900 feet in length. The most impressive structure was the Arrol gantry, a massive steel framework that towered over the construction site like the skeleton of some primordial giant. Designed by the engineering firm of Sir William Arrol, the same company that had built the Forth Bridge in Scotland, the gantry stood 228 feet high, 270 feet wide, and 840 feet long. It weighed more than 6,000 tons and was equipped with numerous cranes and traveling platforms that allowed workers to access every portion of the growing hulls. At night, the gantry was illuminated by electric lights, creating an otherworldly spectacle visible for miles around, a beacon of industrial progress that drew crowds of curious onlookers. On the 31st of March, 1909, the keel of the Titanic was laid down on slipway number 3, exactly 3 months after the keel of her elder sister Olympic had been laid on the adjacent slipway. The keel was the backbone of the ship, a massive steel beam that ran the entire length of the vessel and from which the rest of the structure would rise. It was a moment of ceremony and significance, the official beginning of a construction process that would consume more than 2 years and the labor of thousands of workers. The workforce at Harland and Wolff during the construction of the Olympic-class vessels numbered more than 15,000 men. They came from across Belfast and the surrounding counties, skilled tradesmen and common labourers alike, drawn by the steady wages and the pride of working on the greatest ships the world had ever seen. They were riveters and platers, carpenters and electricians, painters and upholsterers, each contributing their specialized skills to the massive undertaking. The conditions were harsh by modern standards. The workers labored 50 hours per week, from 6 in the morning to 5:30 in the evening, with only Saturday afternoons and Sundays free. The pay was modest, roughly £2 per week for skilled workers, and there were few safety regulations to protect them from the inherent dangers of shipbuilding. The noise was constant and deafening, the clatter of pneumatic hammers and the roar of furnaces creating a cacophony that could be heard throughout the surrounding neighborhoods. The work of constructing the hull was painstaking and physically demanding. The steel plates that would form the skin of the ship arrived at the shipyard already shaped and punched with holes, having been prepared at the steel mills according to precise specifications. Each plate had to be lifted into position, held in place by temporary bolts, and then permanently secured with rivets. The riveting was done by teams of 4 men. The rivet heater maintained a forge where the iron rivets were heated until they glowed cherry red. The holder-up positioned the hot rivet in its hole from inside the hull. The riveter struck the protruding end with a pneumatic hammer, mushrooming the metal to form a tight seal. The catcher caught the rivets thrown from the forge and passed them to the holder-up. This process was repeated more than 3 million times during the construction of the Titanic, as the workers drove rivet after rivet through the overlapping steel plates. The quality of these rivets would later become a subject of considerable scrutiny. Some researchers have suggested that the iron rivets used in the bow and stern of the vessel, as opposed to the steel rivets used in the center section, were more prone to failure under extreme stress. The iron rivets contained impurities known as slag that could make them brittle under certain conditions. Whether this contributed to the disaster remains a matter of debate among historians and engineers, but it speaks to the reality that even the most advanced technology of the era had its limitations. The human cost of the construction was significant. During the 3 years required to build the Titanic, 8 workers lost their lives in the shipyard. 246 injuries were recorded, ranging from minor cuts and bruises to severe crushing injuries and broken bones. Falls from the scaffolding, collisions with moving equipment, and accidents with heavy machinery claimed their toll among the workforce. These men are largely forgotten today, their names recorded only in shipyard ledgers, but they too were part of the Titanic story, their blood and sweat literally woven into the fabric of the vessel. The hull grew steadily throughout 1909 and 1910, the skeleton of steel ribs gradually disappearing beneath the plates that formed the outer skin. The double bottom, a safety feature that provided a second layer of protection below the waterline, was completed. The bulkheads that divided the hull into watertight compartments rose from the keel to their designated heights. The deck beams were installed, providing the framework for the multiple levels that would eventually fill with passengers and crew. By the spring of 1911, the Titanic was ready for launch. The hull was essentially complete, though the interior remained an empty shell awaiting the fitting-out process that would transform bare steel into a floating palace. The launch was scheduled for the 31st of May, chosen to coincide with the arrival of Lord Pirrie's distinguished guests, who would witness this momentous occasion and then proceed to Liverpool to observe the maiden voyage of the Olympic. The launch of the Titanic was a spectacle that drew more than 100,000 spectators to Belfast. They lined the shores of the loch and crowded onto every available vantage point, eager to witness the largest man-made object ever set afloat. The hull weighed more than 26,000 tons and stretched nearly 900 feet, a leviathan of steel about to meet the sea for the first time. At 12:15, a rocket was fired to signal that the launch was imminent. The workers had spent the previous days coating the slipway with a mixture of tallow and train oil to ensure that the massive hull would slide smoothly into the water. Hydraulic rams stood ready to provide the initial push, though the weight of the hull was expected to carry it forward once the supporting shores were knocked away. The shores were removed systematically, each one numbered and cleared in sequence by teams of workers wielding sledgehammers. As the last restraints fell away, the Titanic began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed as she slid down the greased slipway toward the waiting water. The entire journey from slipway to full flotation took just 62 seconds. A great cheer rose from the assembled crowd as the Titanic met the water for the first time. Chains attached to her hull dragged through piles of anchor cable, slowing her momentum and bringing her to a gentle stop in the center of the channel. Tugs quickly moved alongside to take control of the hull and tow it to the fitting-out wharf, where the real work of transformation would begin. The fitting-out process would take nearly a year, as the bare hull was transformed into a functioning vessel complete with engines, boilers, electrical systems, plumbing, ventilation, and all the countless details that would make her habitable. The interior spaces were constructed and decorated, the cabins fitted with furniture, the public rooms outfitted with their elaborate paneling and fixtures. The massive boilers and engines were lowered into the hull through openings that would later be sealed. The propellers were attached, the funnels erected, the mast stepped. Thomas Andrews supervised this process with meticulous attention to detail. He regularly walked through the vessel, notebook in hand, recording observations and corrections. He spoke with the workers, soliciting their input on the practicality of various design elements. He was known for his kindness and his accessibility, qualities that endeared him to the workforce and that would later manifest in his heroic conduct during the disaster. By early April 1912, the Titanic was essentially complete. She had undergone her sea trials on the 2nd of April, performing various maneuvers in Belfast Lock to test her handling characteristics and the reliability of her machinery. The trials were relatively brief, lasting only about 8 hours, partly because the lessons learned from the Olympics' more extensive trials the previous year had already been incorporated into the Titanic's design. The Board of Trade surveyor Francis Carruthers signed the seaworthiness certificate, declaring the Titanic fit for service. The vessel was ready to depart for Southampton, where she would take on passengers and begin her maiden voyage across the Atlantic to New York. The dream that had been sketched on paper 5 years earlier was now reality, a floating palace of steel and glass waiting to carry the hopes and aspirations of thousands across the wide ocean. The Titanic that departed Belfast in early April 1912 was unlike any vessel that had ever sailed the seas. She was a marvel of engineering and design, a floating testament to the confidence and ambition of the Edwardian age. Every detail had been considered, every space designed to provide comfort and elegance to her passengers. She was less a ship than a small city, complete with restaurants, gymnasiums, libraries, smoking rooms, and promenades that would not have been out of place in the finest districts of London or Paris. The technical specifications alone were staggering. The Titanic measured 882 feet and 9 inches in length, roughly the distance of 4 football fields laid end to end. Her breadth was 92 feet and 6 inches, wide enough to accommodate the grand public spaces that would distinguish her from lesser vessels. She displaced more than 52,000 tons when fully loaded, making her the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Her tonnage was measured at 46,329 gross register tons, a figure that represented not her weight but rather the volume of her enclosed spaces. This measurement was important for port fees and crew requirements, and it placed the Titanic slightly ahead of her sister Olympic, which had been measured at 45,324 gross register tons. The Titanic was technically the larger of the two sisters, though the difference was minimal and resulted mainly from the additional enclosed promenade space on the Titanic's A deck. The power plant that drove this enormous vessel was equally impressive. 29 boilers, arranged in 6 boiler rooms stretching nearly the entire length of the ship's lower decks, generated the steam that powered her engines. 24 of these boilers were double-ended, with furnaces on both sides, while 5 were single-ended. Together, they contained 159 furnaces that consumed approximately 600 tons of coal every day. The coal was stored in massive bunkers adjacent to the boiler rooms, holding a total capacity of more than 6,000 tons. Nearly 200 firemen, working in shifts around the clock, shoveled coal into the furnaces to maintain the constant supply of steam. The work was brutal, performed in temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees, with coal dust filling the air and the constant roar of the furnaces creating a hellish environment deep within the ship. The steam generated by these boilers powered 2 massive reciprocating engines, each standing nearly 40 feet tall and weighing more than 1,000 tons. These engines drove the 2 outboard propellers, each measuring more than 23 feet in diameter. A third propeller, positioned at the center of the stern, was driven by a low-pressure Parsons turbine that made use of the exhaust steam from the reciprocating engines. This combination of technologies represented the most advanced propulsion system of its era, providing both efficiency and reliability. Together, these engines generated approximately 50,000 horsepower, enough to propel the Titanic through the water at speeds exceeding 23 knots. Her normal cruising speed was somewhat slower, around 21 knots, which would allow her to cross the Atlantic in approximately 5.5 days. She was not designed to compete for the blue ribbon, but she could maintain a respectable pace while providing a level of comfort that her faster competitors could not match. The safety features of the Titanic were considered state-of-the-art for their time. The hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments by 15 transverse bulkheads that extended upward from the double bottom. These bulkheads were equipped with watertight doors that could be closed electrically from the bridge or manually from the compartment itself. When closed, These doors created barriers that would theoretically prevent water from spreading from a damaged compartment to adjacent ones. The designers had calculated that the Titanic could remain afloat with any 2 of her 16 compartments flooded, or even with the first 4 compartments flooded simultaneously. This capability was unprecedented and led to the widespread belief that the vessel was virtually unsinkable. The trade publication The Shipbuilder had described the Olympic-class vessels as practically unsinkable, and this phrase had been seized upon by the press and public alike. What the designers did not fully appreciate was the vulnerability created by the height of the bulkheads. These barriers did not extend to the full height of the ship but rather rose only a few feet above the waterline at normal trim. If the ship began to sink by the head, taking on water at the bow, the flooding compartments could eventually overflow the top of the bulkheads like water spilling over the edges of an ice cube tray. This design limitation would prove fatal. The lifeboat capacity of the Titanic has become one of the most discussed aspects of her design. She carried 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of 1,178 persons. This was actually more than the Board of Trade regulations required. Those regulations, dating from 1894, had been written for vessels of up to 10,000 tons and had never been updated to reflect the dramatic increase in ship sizes. The Titanic exceeded the requirements by carrying 4 additional collapsible boats. Yet this capacity was woefully inadequate for a vessel that could carry more than 2,200 passengers and crew. The 16 wooden lifeboats could each hold 65 persons, while the 4 Engelhardt collapsible boats could hold 47 each. Even if every boat had been launched fully loaded, more than 1,000 souls would have been left aboard the sinking ship. The question of why more lifeboats were not carried has generated considerable debate. Some have blamed the Board of Trade for failing to update its regulations. Others have pointed to the general confidence in the ship's safety features, which made lifeboats seem more like a regulatory requirement than a practical necessity. There is also evidence that Alexander Carlisle had originally proposed fitting the Titanic with 48 lifeboats, using specially designed davits capable of handling multiple boats, but this proposal was reduced, possibly for aesthetic reasons or to provide more promenade space for first-class passengers. Whatever the reasons, the lifeboat shortage would prove catastrophic. But the passengers who boarded the Titanic in April 1912 gave little thought to such matters. They were drawn instead to the magnificent public spaces and luxurious accommodations that made the vessel a floating palace. The centerpiece of the Titanic's public spaces was the Grand Staircase, a magnificent structure that descended through 7 decks from the boat deck to E-deck. The staircase was constructed of solid English oak, its banisters supported by ornate iron scrollwork, its landings illuminated by an enormous glass dome that flooded the space with natural light during the day and was lit by electric lamps at night. At the top of the staircase, beneath the dome, stood a clock flanked by 2 carved figures representing honor and glory crowning time. The clock's face featured Roman numerals, and the carving was executed in oak to match the surrounding woodwork. The entire composition evoked a sense of grandeur and permanence, as if the passage of time itself had been made subservient to human artistry. The first-class dining saloon was the largest room afloat, measuring 114 feet in length and 92 feet in width, capable of seating more than 500 passengers at a single sitting. The room was decorated in the Jacobean style, with intricately carved oak paneling, leaded glass windows, and elegant furniture upholstered in green leather. The ceiling was mold plaster painted white, providing a light and airy contrast to the darker woodwork below. Adjacent to the dining saloon was the reception room, where passengers gathered before and after meals. This space was decorated in the style of an English country house, with Axminster carpets, wicker furniture, and potted palms creating an atmosphere of refined comfort. A small orchestra often played here during the dinner hour, providing entertainment for the assembled guests. The first-class smoking room, located on a deck, was a masculine retreat decorated in Georgian style with mahogany paneling inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Stained glass windows depicted pastoral scenes, while comfortable leather armchairs invited passengers to linger over cigars and brandy. The room was open only to men, reflecting the social conventions of the era. For exercise and recreation, first-class passengers had access to amenities that would not have been out of place in the finest hotels on land. The gymnasium on the boat deck was equipped with mechanical horses, rowing machines, exercise bicycles, and other apparatus, all supervised by a professional instructor named Thomas Macaulay, who was happy to demonstrate proper technique to interested passengers. The swimming pool, located on the lowest passenger deck, was the first ever installed on an ocean-going vessel. The pool was heated to a comfortable temperature and filled with seawater, providing an opportunity for exercise that was previously unimaginable on a transatlantic crossing. Adjacent to the pool were the Turkish baths, a suite of rooms that included a steam room, cooling room, shampoo room, and hot rooms decorated with elaborately tiled walls and gilded beams in a Moorish style. The squash racket court, located at the bottom of the ship near the bow, was another innovative amenity. Passengers could reserve the court and engage in matches, keeping score with the assistance of a professional attendant. The court was small by modern standards but represented an extraordinary luxury for a vessel at sea. For those who preferred more sedentary pursuits, the Titanic offered libraries, writing rooms, and lounges where passengers could read, write letters, or simply enjoy the passing views through large picture windows. The first-class lounge on a deck was decorated in the style of Louis XV, with carved boiserie panels, silk damask upholstery, and an ornate marble fireplace that provided warmth on cool days. The Café Parisien, a feature that distinguished the Titanic from her sister Olympic, offered a French sidewalk café atmosphere complete with wicker furniture, climbing greenery, and large windows that provided views of the passing sea. This space was popular with younger passengers who found the formal dining saloon too stiff for their tastes. The à la carte restaurant, operated by the famous London restaurateur Luigi Gatti, provided an alternative to the ship's main dining saloon. Passengers who wished to dine here paid additional fees but enjoyed menu selections and service that rivaled the finest restaurants in Europe. Gatti had brought his own staff from London, and the restaurant operated as a semi-independent concession within the larger vessel. The first-class staterooms and suites represented the pinnacle of transatlantic accommodation. The most expensive suites included private promenades, sitting rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, and servant quarters, all decorated in various period styles. The B-deck parlor suites featured half-timbered ceilings and mullioned windows that evoked the great houses of the English countryside. The pricing for these accommodations reflected their exclusivity. A first-class suite could cost as much as £870, equivalent to more than $100,000 in modern currency, for a single crossing. The second-class accommodations, while less elaborate, were still quite comfortable. Contemporary accounts noted that the second-class dining saloon would have passed for first class on many other vessels. The public rooms were paneled in oak and sycamore, with furniture that was attractive if not luxurious. Second-class passengers had their own library, smoking room, and promenades. Even the third-class accommodations represented a significant improvement over the steerage conditions that had characterized earlier generations of immigrant ships. Third-class passengers were housed in small cabins rather than open dormitories, with separate accommodations for single men, single women, and families. They had access to dining saloons, smoking rooms, and open deck space for recreation. While the appointments were plain compared to the upper classes, they were clean, well-ventilated, and infinitely better than the alternatives available on competing lines. The Titanic was equipped with the most advanced communication technology of her era. Her Marconi wireless installation, operated by two specially trained operators, had a range of approximately 400 miles under normal conditions, though signals could travel much farther at night. The wireless call letters assigned to the Titanic were MGY, and her operators maintained constant communication with shore stations and other vessels throughout the voyage. The wireless system was primarily intended for passenger convenience rather than safety. Wealthy travelers could send and receive personal messages, conduct business transactions, and stay connected with events on shore even while crossing the vast Atlantic. The operators were kept busy transmitting these private messages, which generated revenue for the Marconi company that employed them. Safety communications were important but represented only a fraction of the wireless traffic. This, then, was the vessel that departed Southampton on the 10th of April, 1912. She was the largest, most luxurious ship the world had ever seen, equipped with every modern convenience and safety feature her designers could imagine. She represented the pinnacle of an age of confidence, a floating demonstration of what human ingenuity and ambition could achieve. And yet, for all her magnificence, the Titanic remained subject to the fundamental laws of physics. Her hull was still made of steel plates joined by rivets. Her bulkheads, however ingenious, were still finite barriers against an infinite ocean. Her lifeboats, however numerous by regulatory standards, could still not accommodate all her passengers and crew. These limitations would not matter on a normal crossing. The Atlantic had been conquered by steamships for decades, and the routes between Europe and America were well established. The Titanic was designed for routine voyages, not catastrophic emergencies. Her designers assumed that any damage she might suffer would be limited and manageable, that help would always be available from other vessels in the busy shipping lanes, that the worst-case scenarios would remain theoretical abstractions. Those assumptions would be tested in the darkness of a calm April night, when an iceberg drifting silently through the North Atlantic would reveal the limits of human foresight and the terrible price of overconfidence. The Titanic arrived at Southampton on the 3rd of April, 1912, after a brief voyage from Belfast to take up her berth at the White Star Dock. The vessel's arrival created a sensation in the port city as residents gathered to glimpse the magnificent new liner that would soon depart on her maiden voyage to New York. Southampton had become the primary departure point for the great transatlantic liners, displacing Liverpool as the preferred port for the westbound crossing. The city's location on England's southern coast provided convenient access to both London and the Channel ports, allowing passengers to board with minimal overland travel. The harbour facilities had been expanded specifically to accommodate the Olympic-class vessels, with a new deep-water dock capable of handling their enormous draft. The man who would command the Titanic on her maiden voyage was Captain Edward John Smith, the most senior and respected commander in the White Star Line fleet. Smith had been born on the 27th of January, 1850, in the Staffordshire town of Hanley, the son of a potter. He had gone to sea at the age of 17, working his way up through the merchant marine until he joined the White Star Line in 1880. Over the following 3 decades, he had commanded 17 different White Star vessels, earning a reputation for calm competence and personal warmth that endeared him to both passengers and crew. Smith was particularly popular with the wealthy Americans who regularly crossed the Atlantic, earning him the nickname the Millionaire's Captain. Prominent families specifically timed their crossings to coincide with Smith's commands, trusting their safety and comfort to his experienced hands. He had commanded the Olympic on her maiden voyage the previous year and had transferred to the Titanic as a matter of course, the newest and largest vessel in the fleet being assigned to the most senior captain. At 62 years of age, Smith was approaching the end of his maritime career. Contemporary accounts suggest, though the evidence is uncertain, that the Titanic's maiden voyage may have been intended as his final command before retirement. Whether or not this was actually the case, Smith approached his duties with the same professionalism that had characterized his entire career. Smith officially took command of the Titanic on the 1st of April, 1912, supervising the final preparations for the maiden voyage. The vessel needed to be provisioned with food, coal, linens, and the countless supplies required for a transatlantic crossing. The crew needed to be assembled and assigned to their various duties. The passenger accommodations needed to be inspected and prepared. The sea trials had been conducted on the 2nd of April in Belfast Lough, testing the vessel's handling characteristics and the reliability of her machinery. The trials were relatively brief, lasting only about 8 hours, partly because the lessons learned from the Olympics trials had already been incorporated into the Titanic. The vessel performed satisfactorily, demonstrating her ability to accelerate, turn, and stop according to specifications. One interesting test involved the ship's stopping distance. At a speed of approximately 20 knots, the engines were reversed to bring the vessel to a halt. The Titanic required approximately 850 yards to stop completely, a distance of nearly half a mile. This stopping distance would prove relevant on the night of the disaster, though under circumstances far more challenging than the calm waters of Belfast Lock. Francis Carruthers, the Board of Trade surveyor, signed the Certificate of Seaworthiness, declaring the vessel fit for passenger service. The Titanic departed Belfast on the evening of April 2nd, bound for Southampton, where she would take on passengers and cargo for the Atlantic crossing. The departure from Southampton on the morning of April 10th was not without incident. As the Titanic began to move away from her berth, the enormous displacement of water created by her passage caused the smaller vessel New York, moored nearby, to break free from her moorings. The New York swung out into the channel, her stern approaching the Titanic's hull with alarming speed. For a heart-stopping moment, it appeared that the two vessels would collide before the maiden voyage had even properly begun. Quick action by the tugs attending the Titanic averted disaster. The tugboat Vulcan managed to get a line aboard the New York and pull her stern away just as the gap between the two vessels narrowed to approximately 4 feet. Captain Smith ordered the Titanic's engines reversed, slowing her forward progress and allowing the situation to be brought under control. The incident delayed the departure by approximately an hour but caused no damage. Some passengers and observers later regarded this near collision as an ill omen, a warning of the disaster to come. Such superstitions were common among seafarers, who attributed significance to various signs and portents. But most people simply accepted the incident as an unfortunate occurrence of the type that occasionally happened when large vessels maneuvered in confined waters. The Titanic proceeded across the English Channel to Cherbourg, France, where she arrived on the evening of April 10th. The harbour at Cherbourg was too shallow for the Titanic to dock, so passengers were ferried out to the waiting liner by two specially constructed tenders named Nomadic and Traffic. 274 passengers boarded at Cherbourg, many of them wealthy Americans returning home after European holidays or business trips. Among those who boarded at Cherbourg were some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, the great-grandson of the fur trader who had founded the Astor fortune, came aboard with his young wife Madeline, who was 5 months pregnant with their first child. The Astors had been traveling in Europe, escaping the scandal that had surrounded their marriage the previous year. Astor, at 47 years old, had divorced his first wife and married Madeline, who was 30 years his junior. The disapproval of New York society had prompted the couple to extend their honeymoon abroad. Also boarding at Cherbourg was Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate whose family controlled vast mineral wealth. Guggenheim was traveling with his French mistress, the singer Leontine Pauline Aubert, along with his valet and a chauffeur. His wife and children remained in New York, unaware of his extramarital activities. Margaret Tobin Brown, who would later become famous as the Unsinkable Molly Brown, also boarded at Cherbourg. She had been traveling in Europe with her daughter when she received word that her first grandchild was ill. She booked passage on the first available ship, which happened to be the Titanic. The Titanic departed Cherbourg at approximately 8:30 in the evening, steaming westward through the night toward her final European port of call. She arrived at Queenstown, Ireland, on the morning of April 11th, anchoring in the harbour to take on additional passengers and mail. Once again, the water was too shallow for the vessel to dock, so tenders ferried the passengers and cargo out to the waiting liner. 123 passengers boarded at Queenstown, most of them immigrants from Ireland seeking new lives in America. These third-class passengers joined the hundreds already aboard, filling the accommodations on the lower decks with a diverse assemblage of nationalities and languages. They spoke English, Swedish, Finnish, Bulgarian, Arabic, and a dozen other tongues, united only by their common hope for better lives across the sea. 7 passengers disembarked at Queenstown, having booked tickets only for the short crossing from Southampton or Cherbourg. One of them was Francis Brown, a Jesuit seminarian and amateur photographer who had been given a ticket for the first leg of the journey as a gift from his uncle. Brown took numerous photographs during his brief time aboard, capturing images of the grand staircase, the gymnasium, and the passengers on deck. These photographs would later become invaluable historical records of the ship's final days. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon on April 11th, the Titanic weighed anchor and departed Queenstown, heading out into the open Atlantic on the Great Circle route to New York. She carried approximately 2,224 passengers and crew, though the exact number remains uncertain due to conflicting records. The weather was fair, the sea calm, and the great liner settled into the routine of an Atlantic crossing. The final port had fallen astern. Before the Titanic lay 2,000 miles of open ocean, a 5-day voyage across waters that had been crossed by steamships for 70 years. The route was well established, the dangers well known. Captain Smith had made this crossing countless times before, and he approached it with the confidence of long experience. But there was a danger ahead that no amount of experience could fully prepare him for. Drifting southward on the Labrador Current, carried by forces beyond human control, a mountain of ice waited in the darkness of the North Atlantic, directly in the path of the greatest ship the world had ever seen. The passengers who sailed aboard the Titanic represented a remarkable cross-section of early 20th century society. They ranged from some of the wealthiest individuals in the world to some of the poorest, all sharing the same vessel for the journey across the Atlantic. Their stories would become intertwined on the night of April 14th, their fates determined by circumstances of class, location, and chance. The first-class passenger list read like a directory of the Anglo-American elite. The combined wealth of the first-class passengers has been estimated at more than $500 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for that era. These were the titans of industry, the scions of great families, the social arbiters who defined the standards of refinement and taste. John Jacob Astor IV was the wealthiest passenger aboard, with a personal fortune estimated at $87 million. This made him one of the richest men in America, heir to a real estate empire that included vast holdings in Manhattan. Astor had diversified his interests into hotels, developing the Astoria section of what would become the Waldorf Astoria, and had pursued various scientific and technological interests. He had written a science fiction novel, patented a bicycle brake, and generally displayed the eclectic curiosity common to men of great wealth and limited responsibilities. Astor's marriage to the 18-year-old Madeline Force in September 1911 had scandalized New York society. His first wife, Ava, had divorced him 2 years earlier, and the speed with which he had remarried a woman young enough to be his daughter raised eyebrows even in an era that expected wealthy men to take liberties. The couple had escaped to Europe to avoid the social disapproval, traveling through Egypt and France before deciding to return home as Madeline's pregnancy advanced. Benjamin Guggenheim represented another facet of American industrial wealth. His family had made their fortune in mining and smelting, with interests that extended from Colorado to Chile. Benjamin was the 5th of 7 brothers, and while he managed some of the family's business interests, he was perhaps better known for his appreciation of the finer things in life. His presence aboard the Titanic with his French mistress rather than his wife spoke to the moral flexibility that characterized certain segments of the upper class. Isidor Straus and his wife Ida represented a different tradition of American success. Isidor had emigrated from Germany as a child and had built his fortune through the department store Macy's, which he owned in partnership with his brother Nathan. At 67 years old, Isidore was a respected figure in both business and civic affairs, having served briefly in Congress and contributed generously to charitable causes. His marriage to Ida was legendary for its devotion. The couple was rarely seen apart, and their mutual affection was evident to all who knew them. The Wideners of Philadelphia were another prominent family represented aboard the Titanic. George Dunton Widener was heir to a streetcar and traction fortune, while his wife Eleanor and son Harry accompanied him on the voyage. The Wideners had been in Europe for various reasons, including the launch of a horse at the Paris races, and were returning to their substantial obligations in American society. John Borland Thayer was the second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most powerful corporations in America. He traveled with his wife Marion and their 17-year-old son John Jr., who would later provide one of the most detailed survivor accounts of the disaster. The Thayers represented the solid respectability of American corporate leadership, men who built and managed the institutions that shaped modern life. Charles Melville Hayes was the president of the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, returning from a business trip to Europe where he had been arranging financing for his company's expansion. Hayes was a visionary railroad executive who had transformed the Grand Trunk from a regional carrier into a transcontinental system. His death would rob Canada of one of its most capable business leaders. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy, Lady Duff Gordon, represented British aristocratic and commercial interests. Sir Cosmo was a baronet and fencing enthusiast, while Lucy was a pioneering fashion designer whose London salon dressed the most elegant women in England. The couple would later become embroiled in controversy over the circumstances of their survival. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, was technically a passenger rather than an officer, though his position gave him unique access to the ship's operations. Ismay had conceived the Olympic-class vessels and had shepherded their construction through to completion. He occupied one of the finest suites aboard and took his meals in the first-class dining saloon, mixing with the passengers whose patronage supported his company. Thomas Andrews, the designer of the Titanic, was also aboard, conducting the usual post-launch assessment that accompanied a new vessel's maiden voyage. Andrews walked the ship constantly, notebook in hand, recording small imperfections and potential improvements. He was beloved by the crew for his accessibility and his genuine interest in their observations. The ship he had designed and built was his life's work, and he intended to ensure that she performed perfectly. Among the less famous but equally interesting first-class passengers was Margaret Brown, the wife of a Colorado mining magnate who had made his fortune in gold and silver. Margaret was known for her charitable work and her forceful personality, characteristics that would serve her well in the crisis to come. Her later fame as the unsinkable Molly Brown would somewhat overshadow her actual identity, as she was never called Molly during her lifetime. The second-class passengers represented the solid middle class of the era, professional people and skilled tradesmen who could afford comfortable accommodations without the extravagance of first class. Among them were teachers, ministers, merchants, and craftsmen, along with families seeking new opportunities in America. Their stories are less well documented than those of the first-class passengers, but their lives were equally valuable, their losses equally mourned. The third-class passengers were predominantly immigrants, men, women, and children leaving their homelands in search of better lives across the sea. They came from every corner of Europe and beyond, carrying their possessions in trunks and bundles, their hopes invested in the promise of America. The Irish made up a significant portion, but there were also Scandinavians, Eastern Europeans, Syrians, and others, a babel of languages and customs united by common aspirations. The crew of the Titanic numbered approximately 892 persons, ranging from the senior officers who navigated the vessel to the firemen who shoveled coal into the furnaces far below the waterline. They were drawn from Southampton and Liverpool, from Belfast and other port cities, experienced seamen and first-time employees alike. Their fates would be tied to those of the passengers they served. Captain Smith commanded a team of 7 officers. Henry Wilde served as chief officer, having been transferred from the Olympic at the last minute. William Murdoch was the first officer, Charles Lightoller the second officer, and Herbert Pitman, Joseph Boxhall, Harold Lowe, and James Moody filled the remaining positions. These men would bear the burden of command during the disaster, making decisions that would determine who lived and who died. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were technically employees of the Marconi Company rather than the White Star Line, but they served aboard the Titanic and would play crucial roles in the events to come. Phillips, the senior operator, was 25 years old and had been with Marconi for several years. Bride, his junior, was only 22, relatively new to the position but competent at his duties. This assemblage of humanity, rich and poor, famous and anonymous, sailed westward across the Atlantic in the confident expectation of reaching New York on the morning of April 17th. They dined in elegant saloons, strolled the promenades, attended religious services, and occupied themselves with the various diversions available aboard the largest ship in the world. Most gave little thought to the dangers of the sea, trusting in the vessel that carried them and the men who commanded her. Yet among this company were individuals whose actions on the night of April 14th would define them forever. Some would display extraordinary courage, sacrificing their own lives to save others. Some would exhibit the ordinary decency of helping strangers in crisis. Some would behave badly, pushing ahead of women and children to secure places in the lifeboats. And some would simply be swept away by forces beyond their control, their stories ending in the cold dark waters of the Atlantic. The passengers of the Titanic were ordinary people living ordinary lives until the moment when extraordinary circumstances revealed the content of their characters. Their stories continue to fascinate us more than a century later because they remind us of our own vulnerability, our own uncertain courage, our own desperate hope that we would behave well if tested by similar circumstances. The Titanic's voyage across the Atlantic proceeded smoothly through the first 4 days after departing Queenstown. The weather remained fair, the sea calm, and the great liner maintained her steady westward progress at approximately 21 to 22 knots. Captain Smith followed the established shipping lanes, adjusted for the season to avoid the ice that drifted southward from the Arctic during the spring months. The ice conditions in the North Atlantic during April 1912 were later determined to have been the most severe in at least 50 years. An unusually mild winter had allowed large quantities of ice to break free from the Greenland glacier and drift south on the Labrador Current. Icebergs and field ice extended much farther south than normal, creating hazards in waters that were typically free of such dangers at this time of year. Throughout April 14th, the Titanic's wireless operators received multiple ice warnings from other vessels in the vicinity. These messages began early in the day and continued into the evening, painting an increasingly clear picture of the dangerous conditions ahead. The question of how these warnings were handled would later become a central focus of the official inquiries. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the Titanic received a message from the Cunard liner Caronia, reporting bergs, growlers, and field ice in a position that lay directly across the Titanic's planned route. Captain Smith acknowledged this message, and it was posted for the attention of the navigating officers. At 1:42 in the afternoon, a message arrived from the White Star liner Baltic, reporting passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice. This message included the Greek steamer Athenia's report of passing icebergs in similar positions. Captain Smith showed this message to J. Bruce Ismay, who put it in his pocket rather than posting it on the bridge. It was not returned to the navigation officers until Smith asked Ismay for it several hours later. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the German steamer America reported passing 2 large icebergs in a position south of the Titanic's track. This message was addressed to the Hydrographic Office in Washington and was relayed through the Titanic's wireless station. However, it appears that this message was never delivered to the bridge, possibly because it was not specifically addressed to the Titanic. At 7:30 in the evening, the Leyland liner Californian reported 3 large bergs in a position about 50 miles ahead of the Titanic. This message was delivered to the bridge, though the exact handling of it remains uncertain. At 9:40 in the evening, the steamer Masaba sent what would prove to be the most detailed and alarming ice warning. The message reported much heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs, also field ice, in a position that placed the danger directly across the Titanic's path. This critical warning was received by Jack Phillips in the wireless room, but he was deeply engaged in transmitting a backlog of passenger messages to the relay station at Cape Race. The message appears never to have been delivered to the bridge. The wireless system aboard the Titanic had been experiencing technical difficulties earlier in the voyage. The equipment had broken down on April 13, and Phillips and Bride had worked through the night to repair it. The breakdown had created a backlog of passenger messages waiting to be transmitted, and Phillips was focused on clearing this backlog when the Masaba warning arrived. At 10:30 in the evening, the Californian attempted to warn the Titanic of ice ahead. The Californian had stopped for the night, surrounded by field ice, and her wireless operator Cyril Evans wanted to alert the Titanic to the danger. But when he began transmitting, his signal was so strong that it overwhelmed Phillips's receiver, interrupting the passenger traffic he was working on. Phillips's response was curt and dismissive. "Shut up," he transmitted back, "I'm working Cape Race." Evans, offended by this rebuff, waited a few more minutes and then shut down his wireless set and went to bed. It was 11:30, just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. The failure to properly communicate and respond to these ice warnings has been analyzed extensively by historians. Several factors contributed to the problem. The wireless system was primarily intended for commercial traffic rather than safety communications. There was no standardized procedure for handling ice warnings, and their delivery to the bridge depended on the judgment and attentiveness of the operators. The officers on the bridge knew that ice was ahead but did not have a complete picture of the extent and location of the danger. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Titanic, the officers maintained their normal watches as darkness fell on that Sunday evening. The weather conditions were unusual, almost eerily so. The sea was exceptionally calm, described by survivors as like a mill pond, without even the slightest swell. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant, but there was no moon. The air temperature had been falling throughout the afternoon and evening, a clear indication that the ship was approaching ice. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who had the watch from 6 to 10 in the evening, later testified about the conditions. He noted that the calm sea would make it more difficult to spot icebergs, as there would be no breaking waves at their bases. Normally, the white water created by waves striking the ice provided a visual warning of danger ahead. On this night, the icebergs would appear only as dark shapes against the starlit horizon. Lightoller discussed the ice situation with Captain Smith when the commander visited the bridge around 9 o'clock. Smith expressed confidence that the lookouts would spot any ice in time to avoid it, given the clear visibility. The two men agreed that conditions were unusually favorable despite the cold, and that the ship should have adequate warning of any obstacles ahead. At 9:30, Captain Smith retired to his cabin, leaving instructions to be called if conditions became at all doubtful. Lightoller continued his watch until 10 o'clock, when he was relieved by First Officer William Murdoch. Lightoller briefed Murdoch on the ice situation and the captain's instructions before going below. In the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had taken their positions at 10 o'clock, relieving the previous watch. Their task was to scan the horizon ahead for any sign of danger, including icebergs, other vessels, or any other obstacle in the ship's path. They had been provided with no binoculars, a circumstance that would later become the subject of considerable scrutiny. The question of the binoculars has never been fully resolved. A pair of binoculars had been available during the voyage from Belfast to Southampton, but they were subsequently locked away and the key could not be found. Fleet later testified that binoculars would have allowed him to spot the iceberg sooner, giving the ship more time to react. Others have argued that binoculars are more useful for identifying objects already sighted than for initial detection. As 11 o'clock approached, Fleet and Lee noticed a slight haze on the horizon ahead. It was not fog, just a slight mistiness that made the line between sea and sky difficult to distinguish. The air was bitterly cold now, and the men's breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The ship continued to plow forward at her normal speed, her bow wave creating the only disturbance in the glassy calm of the sea. In the first-class dining saloon, the last diners were finishing their meals. In the smoking room, the gentlemen lingered over cigars and cards. In the second-class library, passengers read and conversed. In the third-class common areas, emigrants chatted in their various languages, dreaming of the new lives awaiting them in America. The great ship drove forward through the darkness, her lights blazing, her engines thrumming, carrying more than 2,000 souls toward a rendezvous with fate. Less than an hour remained before everything changed, before the calm, ordinary Sunday evening aboard the Titanic transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. Frederick Fleet stared into the darkness ahead, watching, waiting, unaware that in just a few minutes he would ring the bell that would signal the beginning of the end. The night was calm, almost impossibly so. The Atlantic, that restless body of water known for its fierce storms and towering waves, lay flat and still like black glass beneath the stars. The Titanic pushed forward through this eerie tranquility, her engines driving her at more than 20 knots toward the new world, toward the destiny that awaited in the darkness ahead. In the crow's nest, high above the forward deck, Frederick Fleet pressed his eyes against the cold night air, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. He was 25 years old, a sailor of some experience, standing the watch with his companion Reginald Lee. The two men had been at their post since 10 o'clock, and the bitter cold had seeped into their bones despite the heavy coats they wore. The slight haze that had appeared on the horizon made their task more difficult. It was not quite fog, just a subtle obscuring of the boundary between sea and sky that made objects harder to distinguish. Without binoculars, Fleet had to rely on his naked eyes to spot any obstacles in the ship's path. At approximately 11:39 on the evening of April 14, 1912, Fleet spotted something in the darkness ahead. At first it was just a darker shape against the dark water, difficult to define, growing slowly larger as the ship rushed toward it. Then, with sudden horrifying clarity, he recognized what he was seeing. Fleet struck the bell 3 times and grabbed the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge. When the phone was answered, he delivered the message that would echo through history. Iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch received the warning and acted with the trained reflexes of an experienced seaman. He ordered the helmsman to turn hard to starboard, meaning the ship's head should swing to port, away from the iceberg. Simultaneously, he ordered the engines full astern, hoping to slow the ship's forward momentum and increase the rate of turn. The Titanic was not a maneuverable vessel. At nearly 900 feet in length, displacing more than 50,000 tons, she required considerable time and distance to change course. The tests conducted during sea trials had shown that she needed approximately 850 yards to come to a complete stop from her cruising speed. Turning was even more problematic, as the massive hull resisted any change in direction. For 37 seconds, the ship continued forward while her rudder slowly took effect. The bow began to swing to port, the iceberg looming larger and larger as the gap between them closed. It seemed for a moment that the maneuver might succeed, that the bow would clear the ice and the ship would pass safely by. But the iceberg was larger than it appeared. Like all such ice formations, the greater portion of its mass lay beneath the water, invisible and deadly. As the bow swung clear, the submerged portion of the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull, beneath the waterline, in a collision that lasted approximately 6 seconds. The impact was surprisingly gentle. Many passengers sleeping in their cabins barely noticed, while others described it as a slight shudder, like the ship had run over something rough. In the first-class smoking room, where a card game was in progress, players noticed a tremor in the glasses on the table but thought little of it. In the third-class accommodations near the bow, the impact was more pronounced, with passengers feeling a grinding sensation and hearing the squeal of metal against ice. The officers on the bridge felt the collision clearly. Murdoch immediately closed the watertight doors, using the electric switch on the bridge to drop the heavy barriers into place throughout the lower decks. He then moved to the starboard side to try to glimpse the iceberg as it passed astern, but it had already disappeared into the darkness. Captain Smith arrived on the bridge within moments, roused from his cabin by the unusual motion. His first question was direct. "What have we struck?" Murdoch replied that they had struck an iceberg, that he had tried to port around it but was unable to clear it. Smith ordered the carpenter to sound the ship, to determine whether the hull had been breached and to what extent. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall had arrived on the bridge and was dispatched below to inspect the damage. He descended into the forward compartments, finding no obvious flooding in the areas he visited. But reports were already coming in from other parts of the ship. Thomas Andrews, the designer, had also gone below to investigate, and what he found confirmed the worst fears. The iceberg had not punctured the hull in a single dramatic breach. Instead, it had created a series of narrow openings along the starboard side, spanning approximately 300 feet of the ship's length. The damage extended across the first 6 watertight compartments, from the forepeak through holds 1, 2, and 3, and into boiler rooms 6 and 5. Water was pouring into these spaces at a rate later estimated at 7 long tons per second. Andrews understood immediately what this meant. The Titanic could float with any 2 compartments flooded, even with the first 4 compartments flooded. But she could not float with 6 compartments breached. As the forward compartments filled with water, the bow would sink deeper and deeper. Eventually, the water would overflow the top of the bulkheads, which extended only a few feet above the waterline, and spill into the next compartment astern. The flooding would progress inexorably from bow to stern until the ship could no longer stay afloat. Andrews delivered his assessment to Captain Smith in the stark terms the situation demanded. The ship would sink. It was a mathematical certainty. The only question was how long they had. Andrews estimated that the Titanic would remain afloat for an hour, perhaps an hour and a half at most. Smith absorbed this information with the composure that characterized his command, but he understood immediately that they faced a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The ship carried more than 2,200 passengers and crew. The lifeboats had a capacity of approximately 1,178. Even if every boat was launched fully loaded, more than 1,000 people would be left aboard when the ship went down. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers assembled. The wireless operators were instructed to begin transmitting distress calls, summoning any vessels in the area to come to their aid. The great ship had perhaps 90 minutes left to live, and the race to save as many souls as possible had begun. The moments following the collision were marked by confusion and disbelief. Most passengers had no idea what had occurred, and those who ventured onto the decks to investigate found the officers busy with preparations that seemed routine rather than urgent. The ship was not listing visibly, the lights blazed as brightly as ever, and there was no immediate sense of danger. In the first-class accommodations, stewards knocked on cabin doors and informed passengers that they should put on warm clothing and life jackets and proceed to the boat deck. Many passengers were annoyed at being roused from their beds and questioned whether such inconvenience was really necessary. Some refused to dress and instead went back to sleep, assuming the whole affair was a minor incident that would be resolved by morning. The stewards themselves were often uncertain of the severity of the situation. They had received no clear briefing about the extent of the damage, and they passed along instructions without being able to explain the urgency. The result was a patchwork response, with some passengers responding immediately while others delayed, dressed carefully, packed their valuables, or simply refused to believe that the largest ship in the world could be in genuine peril. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were transmitting the distress call. Phillips had initially sent the standard CQD signal, the maritime distress call that had been in use for years. Bride suggested, half-jokingly, that he should also try the new SOS signal that had recently been adopted. "Send SOS," Bride said, "it's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it." Phillips began alternating between CQD and SOS, adding the Titanic's position and the desperate message that they needed immediate assistance. The position given was 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 14 minutes west, calculated by 4th Officer Boxhall based on the ship's dead reckoning and star sights. This position would later prove to be somewhat inaccurate, placing the distress call approximately 13 miles from the actual location of the sinking. Several ships heard the distress call and responded. The Cunard liner Carpathia, bound from New York to the Mediterranean, was approximately 58 miles away when her wireless operator, Harold Cottam, picked up the transmission. Cottam immediately informed Captain Arthur Rostron, who ordered his ship to turn around and head for the Titanic's position at maximum speed. The Mount Temple, a Canadian Pacific vessel, also received the call and altered course toward the distress position. The Frankfurt, a German steamer, acknowledged the message but seemed not to understand the severity of the situation. The Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, was more than 500 miles away, too far to provide meaningful assistance but anxious for news. Closest of all was the Californian, stopped for the night in the ice field just 10 to 19 miles away. But her wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had shut down his equipment at 11:30, just 10 minutes before the collision. The Californian's radio remained silent while the Titanic's pleas for help crackled through the ether. On the boat deck of the Titanic, the officers began preparing the lifeboats for loading. Second Officer Lightoller took charge of the port side, while First Officer Murdoch supervised the starboard side. Chief Officer Wild moved between the two, coordinating the overall effort. The crew worked to remove the canvas covers from the boats, swing out the davits, and prepare the falls for lowering. The loading of the lifeboats became one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. Lightoller interpreted the captain's order for women and children first as women and children only. He refused to allow men into the portside boats as long as any women remained on deck, even if this meant lowering boats that were less than half full. Murdoch, on the starboard side, interpreted the order more literally, allowing men to board after the women and children had been accommodated. The first lifeboat was lowered at approximately 12:45, more than an hour after the collision. It was boat number 7, on the starboard side, and it carried only 28 people despite having a capacity of 65. The women who boarded were reluctant and had to be encouraged by the officers. Many preferred to remain on the brightly lit, apparently stable ship rather than trust themselves to a small wooden boat on the dark and freezing ocean. Boat after boat went down with similar results. Boat number 6 held only 28 people. Boat number 5 carried 41. Boat number 3 had 32. The pattern continued on both sides of the ship, with most boats launched carrying far fewer passengers than their designed capacity. Several factors contributed to this tragic underutilization. The passengers, particularly in first class, simply did not believe the ship was in genuine danger. The boat seemed flimsy compared to the massive liner, and the black water far below was terrifying. The officers were uncertain whether the davits could safely lower boats that were fully loaded, even though tests had demonstrated that they could. And there was a general assumption that more boats would be available, that this was merely a precautionary evacuation rather than a desperate flight from a dying ship. As the minutes passed, the situation became clearer. The boat was sinking deeper, the forward deck gradually disappearing beneath the rising water. The band, assembled in the first-class lounge and later on the boat deck, played ragtime tunes and popular melodies in an effort to keep the passengers calm. Their music provided a surreal counterpoint to the growing chaos. The role of the SS Californian in the Titanic disaster remains one of the most debated aspects of that tragic night. The Californian was a Leyland Line steamer of modest size, commanded by Captain Stanley Lord, which had stopped for the night in the ice field approximately 10 to 19 miles from the Titanic's position. The exact distance has been disputed for over a century. At approximately 11 o'clock, the Californian's third officer had observed the lights of a large steamer approaching from the east. The lights appeared to stop and then seemed to turn, as if the vessel were changing course. Around the same time, the officers and crew observed what appeared to be rockets or flares being fired from the direction of the stranger. The use of rockets at sea was not standardized in 1912. White rockets were sometimes used as company signals to identify vessels to one another. Distress signals typically involved rockets of any color fired at intervals of about 1 minute, but this protocol was not universally followed or understood. The officers of the Californian observed the rockets but were uncertain of their meaning. Captain Lord was informed of the rockets but did not order his ship to investigate. He suggested that the officers try to contact the vessel by Morse lamp, which they attempted without success. The stranger did not respond to their signals. Lord later testified that he believed the rockets might be company signals and that he did not associate them with a distress situation. The failure of the Californian to respond has been condemned by many historians and by the official inquiries that followed the disaster. If the Californian had immediately raised steam and proceeded toward the rockets, she might have arrived at the scene while the Titanic was still afloat, potentially saving hundreds of additional lives. The proximity of the two vessels, and the apparent indifference of the Californian's officers to the obvious signals of distress, remains one of the most troubling aspects of the entire tragedy. Captain Lord maintained for the rest of his life that the vessel seen from the Californian was not the Titanic, that there must have been another ship between the two. This theory, known as the mystery ship hypothesis, has found some supporters among subsequent researchers but has been rejected by most historians. The weight of evidence suggests that the Californian saw the Titanic and failed to respond to her distress signals. The Californian did finally attempt to contact the distressed vessel by wireless at approximately 5:30 in the morning, after her operator Evans had risen and turned on his equipment. By then, of course, it was far too late. The Titanic had been on the bottom for more than 3 hours, and the rescue was already underway by another vessel. As the Titanic settled deeper into the Atlantic, the true dimensions of the catastrophe became apparent to all aboard. The bow was now fully submerged, the forward well deck awash with the rising sea. The stern had begun to lift out of the water, exposing the massive propellers that had driven the ship across the ocean. The angle of the deck made movement increasingly difficult, and the remaining passengers began to cluster at the stern, the highest point of the dying vessel. In these final hours, individuals revealed their characters in ways that would be remembered for generations. Some displayed extraordinary courage and selflessness. Others succumbed to panic or self-preservation. Most simply did the best they could in circumstances that exceeded any reasonable expectation of human endurance. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet, Victor Giglio, had initially put on life jackets and assisted with the loading of the lifeboats. But as the situation became hopeless, Guggenheim made a decision that would define his memory. He and Giglio returned to their cabins and changed into evening dress, emerging in their finest attire. "We've dressed in our best," Guggenheim reportedly told a steward, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He asked that a message be delivered to his wife, telling her that no woman was left on the ship because he was a coward. He spent his final moments in the first-class smoking room, drinking brandy and waiting for the end. Isidore and Ida Strauss presented another example of devotion that transcended even the desperate instinct for survival. Ida was offered a place in one of the boats but refused to leave her husband's side. "I will not be separated from my husband," she declared. "As we have lived, so will we die, together." Isidore, at 67 years old, could have claimed the privilege of age, but he refused to board while younger men remained behind. The couple was last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands as the water rose around them. Their bodies were never recovered, but their devotion became one of the most celebrated stories of the disaster. A memorial erected in their honor carries the inscription, "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it." John Jacob Astor escorted his young pregnant wife Madeline to lifeboat number 4, helping her into the boat with care and tenderness. He then asked Second Officer Lightoller if he might be permitted to accompany her, explaining that she was in a delicate condition. Lightoller refused, saying that no men could board until all the women had been loaded. Astor accepted this decision without argument, stepped back from the boat, and was never seen alive again. The body of John Jacob Astor was recovered a week later by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. He was identified by the initials on his collar and by the substantial sum of money found in his pockets. His watch had stopped at 3:27, suggesting that he may have survived in the water for over an hour after the sinking before succumbing to the cold. Captain Smith remained on the bridge throughout the crisis, coordinating the evacuation and making the terrible decisions that circumstances demanded. Witnesses reported seeing him moving about the deck, megaphone in hand, calling out orders and encouragement. As the end approached, he released the crew from their duties with the words, "Now it's every man for himself." The exact manner of Captain Smith's death remains uncertain. Some witnesses reported seeing him enter the water as the bridge went under. Others claimed he swam to an overturned collapsible boat and then turned away, choosing to die rather than take a place that might save another. One account has him swimming to a lifeboat carrying a child, handing the infant to the occupants, and then swimming away into the darkness. None of these accounts can be verified, and Smith's body was never recovered. Thomas Andrews, the designer of the Titanic, spent the final hours helping passengers find life jackets and directing them to the boat deck. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, standing alone before the fireplace, staring at a painting called Plymouth Harbor that hung on the wall above. His life jacket lay on a table beside him, unused. He made no attempt to save himself, perhaps unwilling to survive the destruction of his creation, perhaps simply exhausted by the weight of what he had witnessed. His body was never recovered. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, remained at their post until almost the very end, transmitting distress calls long after Captain Smith had released them from duty. Phillips continued to work the equipment even as the boat deck began to flood, the water rising around his ankles as he tapped out the final messages. At approximately 2:10, with the wireless cabin filling with water, Bride convinced Phillips that they had to leave. The two men made their way to the roof of the officers' quarters, where collapsible boat B lay upside down on the deck. A wave swept them off their feet and into the water. Bride eventually reached the overturned boat and climbed onto its keel, joining others who had found this precarious refuge. Phillips also reached the boat initially but apparently died from exposure during the night. His body was never recovered. Harold Bride survived, though his feet were badly frostbitten from his hours on the overturned collapsible. He was able to assist the wireless operator on the Carpathia during the rescue, helping to transmit the lists of survivors to an anxious world. His testimony at the subsequent inquiries provided crucial details about the events in the wireless room. Wallace Hartley and his band of musicians became the most celebrated heroes of the disaster. The 8 men continued to play throughout the sinking, their music providing a measure of comfort and calm to the terrified passengers. They began in the first-class lounge and later moved to the boat deck, playing popular melodies and hymns as the ship settled beneath them. The precise music they played in their final moments has been the subject of considerable debate. The most persistent tradition holds that their last piece was the hymnera, "My God, to Thee," and this is the account that has become embedded in popular memory. Some survivors, however, reported hearing the Walsonge d'Automne, or other pieces entirely. The truth may never be known. What is certain is that the musicians played until they could play no more, then stood together as the water rose around them. All 8 died. Only 3 bodies were recovered. Hartley's body was found more than a week later, still wearing his bandsman's uniform, his music case strapped to his body. He was buried in his hometown of Colne, Lancashire, where more than 30,000 people lined the streets for his funeral procession. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the Titanic's forward deck had completely disappeared beneath the water. The ship was tilted at an increasingly steep angle, her stern rising as the bow sank deeper. The 4 great funnels, which had been horizontal for the entire voyage, now pointed upward at alarming angles. The light still blazed throughout the vessel, powered by the engineers who remained at their posts in the depths of the ship. The engineers of the Titanic represent one of the most remarkable stories of sacrifice in the entire disaster. These men, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, kept the lights burning and the pumps running long after any hope of saving the ship had passed. Their efforts allowed the evacuation to proceed in illuminated decks rather than total darkness, undoubtedly saving many additional lives. None of the engineers survived. All 35 officers and men of the engineering department remained at their posts until the end, going down with the ship they had served. Their names are inscribed on memorials in Southampton and Liverpool, though they are often overlooked in accounts that focus on the passengers and deck officers. As the angle of the deck steepened, the remaining passengers and crew found themselves unable to maintain their footing. People slid down the deck, tumbling over chairs and railings, falling into the rising water. Some clung to anything they could grasp, fighting to stay above the surface for as long as possible. Others jumped voluntarily, preferring the relatively quick death of the freezing water to the horror of riding the ship down. The final plunge began at approximately 2:17. The lights, which had burned continuously throughout the sinking, flickered once and then went out, plunging the scene into complete darkness. Witnesses in the lifeboats heard a tremendous roar as everything movable inside the ship broke loose and crashed forward, as the boilers tore from their mountings and smashed through the internal bulkheads. Then, in the darkness, the ship broke apart. The stress of the angle, combined with the weight of the flooded bow and the buoyancy of the stern, exceeded the structural limits of the hull. The Titanic broke in 2 between the second and third funnels, roughly at the point where the forward expansion joint weakened the structure. The bow section, freed from the weight of the stern, plunged toward the bottom at high speed, reaching the ocean floor approximately 2.5 miles below in a matter of minutes. The stern section, momentarily buoyant, settled back toward horizontal before beginning its own final descent. Witnesses described the stern rising until it was nearly vertical, hanging in the air for what seemed like an eternity before sliding beneath the surface. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. She had been afloat for less than 5 days since her launch, had been at sea for less than 4 days since departing Southampton. She had carried the dreams and hopes of thousands, had embodied the confidence of an age that believed in the inevitable triumph of human progress. Now she was gone, taking more than 1,500 souls with her into the darkness. The water in which the survivors now floated was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, several degrees below freezing. At this temperature, the human body loses heat faster than it can generate it, and death from hypothermia occurs within 15 to 30 minutes for most people. The screams of the dying carried across the water to the lifeboats, a sound that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. One survivor, Eva Hart, who was 7 years old at the time, later described the screams as the most dreadful sound she had ever heard. It went on for some considerable time, she recalled, and then gradually the sounds became quieter and quieter, until finally there was silence. The lifeboats were scattered across the water, most of them only partially filled, containing perhaps 700 souls out of the more than 2,200 who had sailed from Southampton. Many boats had the capacity to return and pick up swimmers, but fear of being swamped by the desperate masses kept most of them away. Fifth Officer Lowe was one of the few who attempted a rescue, transferring passengers between boats to create an empty boat that could safely approach the swimmers. Lowe waited until the screaming had largely died away before making his attempt, concerned that a crowd of panicking swimmers would overwhelm his boat. By the time he reached the area where the ship had gone down, most of those in the water were already dead. He pulled 13 people from the sea, but 4 of them died before morning. Of the approximately 1,500 people who went into the water, only 13 were rescued from the sea. The cold had done its terrible work. On the overturned collapsible B, approximately 30 men balanced precariously on the keel, standing in rows to keep the waterlogged canvas boat from capsizing. Among them were Second Officer Lightoller, Harold Bride, and Colonel Archibald Gracie. They spent the night standing in the freezing darkness, their feet in the water, shifting their weight to keep the boat stable. Several men died during the night and slipped off into the sea. As dawn approached, the survivors in the boats began to see ice all around them. Icebergs of all sizes dotted the water, some towering hundreds of feet above the surface. The field ice through which the Carpathia would have to navigate stretched to the horizon. The same ice that had destroyed the Titanic now surrounded her survivors, a cold reminder of nature's indifferent power. The RMS Carpathia had been steaming at full speed toward the Titanic's distress position since receiving the call at 12:25. Captain Arthur Henry Rostron had immediately ordered his ship turned around and had taken every possible measure to maximize her speed and prepare for rescue operations. Rostron was a capable and decisive commander who responded to the emergency with remarkable efficiency. He ordered the ship's heating and hot water systems shut down to divert all available steam to the engines. He posted extra lookouts to watch for ice. He ordered the ship's doctors to prepare the medical facilities and organized his crew into teams to receive survivors. The Carpathia was not a fast ship, capable of only about 14 knots under normal circumstances. But Rostron pushed her to 17 knots that night, faster than she had ever traveled before. The chief engineer later said that the ship seemed to know that lives depended on her speed and responded accordingly. The journey through the ice field was treacherous. Lookouts spotted iceberg after iceberg in the darkness, and Rostron had to alter course repeatedly to avoid them. The ship weaved through the obstacles at high speed, taking risks that under normal circumstances would have been considered reckless. But these were not normal circumstances. The Carpathia arrived at the Titanic's last reported position at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. The sea was empty. No great liner rode the waves, no lights shone on the horizon. For a terrible moment, Rostron feared that the distress call had been a hoax or that he had somehow missed the ship in the darkness. Then a green light was spotted low on the water. It was lifeboat number 2, firing a flare to attract attention. The Carpathia altered course toward the light and soon found herself surrounded by lifeboats scattered across a wide area of ocean. The rescue had begun. The survivors were brought aboard by various means. Those who could climb managed the rope ladders that had been hung over the side. Others were hoisted up in slings or bosun's chairs. The smallest children were lifted up in mail sacks, the quickest and safest method of getting them aboard. The Carpathia's crew worked with extraordinary efficiency, showing kindness and compassion to the traumatized survivors. The first lifeboat was alongside at 10 in the morning. The last survivor was brought aboard at 8:30. In between, 712 people were rescued from the lifeboats and transferred to the relative warmth and safety of the Carpathia. They were given blankets, hot drinks, and what comfort could be provided to people who had just survived the greatest maritime disaster in history. As the sun rose on the morning of April 15th, the full extent of the tragedy became visible. The ice field stretched in all directions, studded with icebergs of every size and description. Deck chairs, life jackets, and debris floated on the calm water, the only visible evidence of the great ship that had passed this way just hours before. The bodies of the dead drifted among the wreckage, though most had already sunk beneath the surface. Captain Rostron considered searching for additional survivors but concluded that anyone still in the water would have long since succumbed to the cold. He also faced the question of what to do with the survivors he had rescued. His ship had been bound for the Mediterranean, but that destination was now out of the question. After consulting with J. Bruce Ismay, who had been rescued from collapsible sea, Rostron decided to return to New York. The voyage to New York took 3 days, during which the survivors huddled in borrowed spaces, grieving for the lost and uncertain of what awaited them on shore. Many had lost everything: their possessions, their family members, their hopes for new lives in America. They wore borrowed clothes and slept on borrowed blankets, dependent on the charity of strangers. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of April 18th, passing the Statue of Liberty as more than 40,000 people crowded the docks waiting for news. The ship paused at the White Star Pier to offload the Titanic's lifeboats, the only physical remnants of the great vessel to reach New York. Then she proceeded to the Cunard Pier, where the survivors finally disembarked onto American soil. Captain Rostron became an international hero. He was knighted by King George V, received the Congressional Gold Medal from President Taft, and was presented with a silver cup and gold medal by Margaret Brown on behalf of the Titanic survivors. His actions that night represented the best of maritime tradition, the willingness to risk everything to save fellow seafarers in distress. The Carpathia herself met a fate that echoed her finest hour. On July 17, 1918, while serving as a troopship during the First World War, she was torpedoed by the German submarine U-55 off the coast of Ireland. She sank in the early morning hours, taking 5 of her crew with her. The ship that had saved the survivors of the Titanic now lies on the bottom of the Atlantic herself, another victim of the sea's unforgiving nature. The aftermath of the disaster rippled across 2 continents in waves of grief, anger, and disbelief. In Southampton, where most of the crew had been recruited, the tragedy struck with particular force. More than 500 households in that port city lost family members, and some streets had scarcely a house that was not touched by the disaster. The offices of the White Star Line were besieged by anxious relatives seeking news, and the posting of the casualty lists brought scenes of heartbreak that witnesses would never forget. In New York, the arrival of the Carpathia became a major public event. Thousands of people crowded the harbor despite the late hour and the rain that had begun to fall. Reporters from every major newspaper competed for interviews with survivors, and the stories they published filled column after column in the days that followed. The Titanic disaster became the first modern media event, dominating the news in ways that no previous tragedy had done. The wealthy families who had lost members aboard the ship commanded particular attention. The Astor's, the Wideners, the Strausses, and others saw their private grief become public spectacle. Memorial services were held in churches and synagogues across the country, attended by thousands who had never known the deceased but who felt connected to the tragedy nonetheless. The body recovery operations that followed the sinking were grim and necessary work. The cable ship Mackay Bennett departed Halifax on April 17, for days after the disaster, carrying tons of ice and scores of coffins. Over the following weeks, she and her companion vessels recovered more than 300 bodies from the area where the Titanic had sunk. The recovery crews faced difficult decisions about which bodies to bring back to Halifax and which to commit to the sea. Those who could be identified and whose condition permitted transport were embalmed and stored in ice for the journey home. Many others, particularly those whose bodies had deteriorated or who appeared to be of lower social class, were given sea burials with appropriate religious rites. This practice later caused controversy, as it seemed to perpetuate in death the class distinctions that had characterized the disaster itself. The bodies brought back to Halifax underwent careful examination. Personal effects were catalogued, descriptions were recorded, and photographs were taken when possible. These records allowed many families to claim their dead and provide proper burials. But despite these efforts, more than 100 bodies remained unidentified. They were buried in 3 Halifax cemeteries, their graves marked only with numbers, their identities lost forever to the sea. Among those recovered was John Jacob Astor, identified by his initials and the substantial fortune he carried in his pockets. The bodies of Benjamin Guggenheim and Captain Smith were never found. Thomas Andrews disappeared without a trace. The sea kept many of its secrets that night, and the families of the lost were left to mourn without the closure that a proper burial might have provided. In the days and weeks following the disaster, the grim work of recovering the dead began. The cable ship Mackay Bennett was dispatched from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to search the area where the Titanic had sunk. Over several voyages, the ship and her companions recovered more than 300 bodies from the sea. The recovery crews faced difficult decisions about which bodies to bring back and which to bury at sea. Those who could be identified and whose condition was suitable for transport were embalmed and stored in ice for return to Halifax. Others, particularly those of lower social status or whose bodies had deteriorated, were given sea burials. This practice later caused controversy, as it appeared to perpetuate in death the class distinctions that had characterized the disaster itself. The bodies brought back to Halifax were examined, photographed, and catalogued before being released to their families. Those who remained unclaimed were buried in 3 Halifax cemeteries, where their graves can still be visited today. Many of the markers bear only numbers, the identities of the dead having never been established. The Titanic disaster prompted immediate calls for investigation on both sides of the Atlantic. Within days of the Carpathia's arrival in New York, a United States Senate inquiry had been convened under the leadership of Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan. The British Board of Trade inquiry, presided over by Lord Mersey, began on May 2. The American inquiry was characterized by Senator Smith's aggressive questioning and his determination to hold individuals accountable for the disaster. Smith, who had no maritime experience, asked questions that sometimes seemed naive to the seafaring witnesses but which effectively exposed the failures of judgment and communication that had contributed to the tragedy. His questioning of surviving officers revealed the confusion that had surrounded the evacuation, the half-empty lifeboats, and the failure to heed ice warnings. J. Bruce Ismay was a particular focus of American criticism. His survival, while more than 1,500 others had perished, raised questions about his conduct during the evacuation. Ismay testified that he had helped load lifeboats and had entered collapsible sea only when there were no women in the vicinity and the boat was about to be lowered. His account was accepted by the inquiries but did little to salvage his reputation. He resigned from the White Star Line within months and spent the remaining 25 years of his life largely in seclusion, a broken man haunted by the disaster that had consumed his greatest achievement. Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian was questioned extensively about his ship's failure to respond to the Titanic's distress signals. Lord maintained that the rockets seen from his ship had not been recognized as distress signals and that the vessel observed was not the Titanic. The inquiries found his explanations unconvincing and concluded that the Californian might have saved many lives if she had responded promptly. Lord never recovered from this verdict, spending the rest of his life attempting to clear his name. The British inquiry, while more technically sophisticated than its American counterpart, reached similar conclusions about the causes of the disaster. The inquiry found that the collision with the iceberg was the direct cause of the sinking, but identified numerous contributing factors including excessive speed, inadequate lookout arrangements, and insufficient lifeboat capacity. The inquiry recommended sweeping changes to maritime safety regulations. The testimony of survivors provided crucial evidence for both inquiries. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the most senior surviving officer, described the chaos of the evacuation and defended his decisions regarding lifeboat loading. Third-class passengers testified about the difficulties they faced in reaching the boat deck, though the inquiries found no evidence that the gates between classes had been deliberately locked. Wireless operator Harold Bride provided detailed accounts of the distress calls and the final moments in the radio room. The investigations resulted in sweeping changes to maritime safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, was adopted in 1914 and established comprehensive standards for ship construction, equipment, and operation. The convention required sufficient lifeboat capacity for all persons aboard, not merely the minimum required by outdated tonnage formulas. This single change ensured that future disasters would not be compounded by a shortage of life-saving equipment. The Radio Act of 1912, passed by the United States Congress, required all vessels carrying more than 50 persons to maintain a continuous radio watch. This regulation ensured that distress calls would not go unheard because wireless operators had gone off duty for the night. The law also required ships to have adequate backup power for their wireless equipment and established procedures for prioritizing distress communications over commercial traffic. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914 to monitor iceberg conditions in the North Atlantic and provide warnings to shipping. Originally funded by the nations whose citizens were at risk, the patrol continues to operate today, using aircraft and satellite imagery to track ice movements and alert vessels to dangerous conditions. In the more than a century since its founding, no ship heeding the ice patrol's warnings has been lost to ice. The construction standards for ships were also revised, with requirements for watertight bulkheads to extend higher in the hull and for double hulls below the waterline. These changes reflected the lessons learned from the Titanic, whose advanced safety features had proven inadequate when confronted with damage more extensive than the designers had anticipated. The principles established in the wake of the Titanic disaster continue to inform ship design to this day. The Titanic disaster also changed cultural attitudes about technology and progress. The Edwardian confidence that human ingenuity could conquer nature was shaken by the loss of the greatest ship in the world on her maiden voyage. The phrase practically unsinkable, which had been used with pride before the disaster, became a byword for hubris and overconfidence. The tragedy served as a humbling reminder that nature remains indifferent to human pretensions, and that no achievement of engineering can guarantee safety against all possible dangers. In the years and decades that followed, the Titanic assumed a permanent place in popular culture. Books, films, songs, and memorials kept the memory of the disaster alive, even as those who had experienced it gradually passed away. The ship became a symbol of various themes depending on the era and the interpreter, representing the dangers of pride, the injustice of class distinctions, the nobility of sacrifice, or the fragility of human achievement. The first major film about the disaster appeared in 1943, a Nazi propaganda production that portrayed the British crew and passengers in an unflattering light. A British production followed in 1958, with Kenneth More portraying Second Officer Lightoller. The most famous adaptation came in 1997, when James Cameron's epic film Titanic became the highest-grossing movie in history at that time, introducing a new generation to the tragedy and cementing the ship's place in popular imagination. For 73 years after the sinking, the Titanic lay undiscovered on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. The exact location of the wreck was unknown, and the technology to search the deep ocean floor did not exist during the early decades after the disaster. Various proposals were made to locate and even raise the ship, some practical and others fantastical, but none came to fruition. The early proposals for recovering the Titanic ranged from the ingenious to the absurd. One scheme suggested filling the hull with ping-pong balls that would provide enough buoyancy to raise the wreck to the surface. Another proposed injecting the hull with Vaseline or other substances that would displace the water. A third suggested freezing the wreck in a block of ice that would then float to the surface. None of these proposals were technically feasible, and they demonstrated how little was understood about the challenges of deep-sea salvage. The search for the Titanic became a serious scientific endeavor in the early 1980s. Multiple expeditions were mounted, including 3 by the Texas oil man Jack Grimm between 1980 and 1983. Grimm's expeditions covered extensive areas of the search zone but failed to locate the wreck, though one of his searches may have inadvertently photographed one of the ship's propellers without recognizing it. The failures of these early expeditions demonstrated the difficulty of finding a relatively small object in the vastness of the ocean floor. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1985, when a joint French-American expedition succeeded in locating the wreck. The French research vessel Le Suroit, operated by the French Oceanographic Institute IFREMA, conducted the initial search using sonar technology. When the French portion of the expedition ran out of time, the American research vessel Nor, operated by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, continued the search using a remotely operated camera system called Argo. The expedition was led by Robert Ballard, an American oceanographer who had become fascinated with deep-sea exploration. Ballard employed a clever strategy, searching not for the main wreck but for the debris field that would have been created when the ship sank. He reasoned that the debris would be spread over a much larger area than the wreck itself and would therefore be easier to find. This approach, combined with the superior technology of the Argo system, proved decisive. The discovery came in the early morning hours of September 1, 1985. The Argo camera system was being towed across the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet when it passed over an area of man-made objects scattered on the seafloor. The operators recognized one of the objects as a boiler, identical to the boilers that had powered the Titanic. Further exploration soon revealed the main body of the wreck. What the world did not know at the time was that Ballard's expedition had a secret purpose. The United States Navy had sponsored the search as cover for a classified mission to investigate the wrecks of 2 nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, which had been lost in the Atlantic during the 1960s. Ballard was obligated to spend most of his expedition time photographing these military wrecks, which left him only 12 days to search for the Titanic. The fact that he found the ship in such a limited time window was a remarkable achievement. The news of the discovery was greeted with global fascination. The ship that had captured the world's imagination in 1912 had been found, lying on the bottom of the Atlantic in 2 main sections approximately 2,000 feet apart. The bow section was relatively intact, while the stern section had been severely damaged, apparently by the impact with the ocean floor. The wreck lies at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, in international waters approximately 325 nautical miles southeast of Newfoundland. Ballard returned to the wreck site in 1986 with the manned submersible Alvin, which allowed him to make direct visual observations of the ship. The expeditions revealed the remarkable state of preservation of some features, including the brass railings, the glass windows, and the elaborate ironwork of the bow. They also revealed the damage, the gaping holes in the hull, the collapsed superstructure, the scattered debris field containing everything from coal to champagne bottles to personal belongings. The small remotely operated vehicle Jason Jr. was deployed from Alvin to explore the interior of the wreck. It entered through the opening where the grand staircase had once stood, descending into the heart of the ship where passengers had dined and danced on that final evening. The staircase itself was gone, its wooden structure having long since been consumed by wood-boring organisms. But the iron framework remained, along with chandeliers and other fixtures that still hung in the murky darkness. The discovery of the wreck raised difficult questions about preservation and salvage. Ballard advocated for leaving the site undisturbed as a memorial to those who had died. Others argued that artifacts should be recovered for historical and scientific study. Still others proposed commercial salvage operations to recover items of monetary value. The debate continues to this day. The controversy intensified in 1987 when a French-American expedition led by IFRMA recovered approximately 1,800 artifacts from the debris field. Subsequent expeditions recovered thousands more objects, including personal items, ship fittings, and pieces of the hull itself. In 1998, an expedition recovered a large section of the hull, weighing approximately 20 tons, from the debris field. This section, known as the Big Piece, now forms the centerpiece of traveling Titanic exhibitions. The ethics of artifact recovery remain debated. Supporters argue that the objects preserve history and allow people to connect with the tragedy in a tangible way. Critics contend that the site is a grave and should be treated with the same respect as any cemetery. The families of some victims have protested the recovery operations, while others have welcomed the preservation of items that might otherwise be lost to decay. Among the most poignant artifacts recovered was a collection of personal belongings that spoke to the individual lives lost in the disaster. A pair of spectacles. A leather bag containing currency and coins. A pocket watch stopped at the moment of its owner's death. These objects, mundane in themselves, became powerful reminders of the human beings who had once owned them, ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. The wreck itself is gradually deteriorating. The iron hull is being consumed by microorganisms, including a species of bacteria discovered at the site and named Halomonas titanici in honor of the ship. Scientists estimate that the bacteria and other organisms are consuming approximately 400 pounds of iron per day. At this rate, the bow section, the most intact portion of the wreck, may collapse entirely within the next decade or two. The deterioration has been documented by successive expeditions to the site. Features that were intact when first photographed in 1986 have since collapsed or disappeared. The crow's nest, from which Frederick Fleet first spotted the iceberg, fell from the mast sometime in the 1990s. The captain's bathtub, a distinctive feature of early photographs, has broken through the deteriorating deck. The famous bow railing, made iconic by the 1997 film, has shown increasing signs of deterioration in recent years. The Titanic's final resting place lies in international waters, beyond the jurisdiction of any single nation. In 2012, on the centenary of the sinking, the wreck site was designated a UNESCO-protected cultural heritage site. This designation provides some legal protection against unauthorized interference but cannot prevent the natural processes of decay that are gradually erasing the ship from existence. In June 2023, the wreck site became the scene of another tragedy when the submersible Titan, operated by the company OceanGate Expeditions, imploded during a descent to view the Titanic. All 5 people aboard were killed instantly, including the company's chief executive and 4 passengers who had each paid substantial sums for the opportunity to see the famous wreck. The disaster highlighted the risks of deep-sea exploration and prompted renewed debate about the safety of commercial ventures to such extreme depths. The Titan's destruction occurred at almost the same depth as the Titanic wreck itself, a grim coincidence that underscored the unforgiving nature of the deep ocean. Recent expeditions have documented the continued deterioration of the wreck. Sections that were intact a decade ago have now collapsed. The famous bow railing, photographed countless times since the discovery, has recently shown signs of significant decay. The ship that was once the largest moving object in the world is slowly returning to the sea that claimed her, atom by atom, molecule by molecule. The stern section of the wreck lies in particularly poor condition. When the ship broke in two during the sinking, the stern section had remained buoyant for a brief time before beginning its own descent to the bottom. During that descent, air trapped inside the hull caused it to implode, creating devastating damage. The decks are pancaked together, the interior space is crushed into a chaotic mass of twisted metal. Personal effects and ship fittings lie scattered across the debris field, the only recognizable remnants of what had been a floating palace. The debris field itself extends for approximately half a mile between the bow and stern sections. Thousands of objects lie scattered across the ocean floor, including lumps of coal from the ship's bunkers, bottles of wine from the stores, personal belongings of the passengers and crew. A pair of shoes lying side by side marks the spot where a body once lay, the flesh long since consumed by the creatures of the deep, only the leather remaining to testify to a life lost. More than a century after her loss, the Titanic continues to fascinate and move us. The disaster has inspired countless books, films, songs, and works of art, each generation finding new meanings in the tragedy. The ship has become a symbol of human ambition and human frailty, of the grandeur and the danger of our eternal desire to challenge the limits of nature. The survivors of the Titanic carried their memories to the end of their lives. Many were reluctant to speak of their experiences, the trauma too deep to share easily. Others became advocates for maritime safety or campaigners for the memory of those who had been lost. Some achieved fame, like Margaret Brown, whose colorful personality and involvement in the rescue efforts made her a celebrity. Others lived quietly, their connection to the disaster known only to family and friends. The passengers and crew who sailed aboard the Titanic have long since passed into history. The last survivor, Milvina Dean, who was only 2 months old when the ship sank, died on May 31, 2009, at the age of 97. With her passing, the living memory of the disaster came to an end. What remains is documented history, preserved artifacts, and the stories that have been told and retold across the decades. The class divisions that characterized the disaster have been much discussed. First-class women survived at a rate of 97%, while third-class women survived at only 46%. First-class children had a better survival rate than third-class adults. The gates that separated the classes were not locked, contrary to some popular accounts, but the geography of the ship and the priorities of the crew ensured that those at the top had the best chance of survival. The third-class passengers faced particular challenges in reaching the boat deck. Their accommodations were located in the lower portions of the ship, far from the lifeboats. The route to the upper decks was complicated by the ship's layout, which was designed to keep the classes separate during normal operations. When the emergency came, many third-class passengers struggled to find their way through unfamiliar corridors and stairways, arriving on the boat deck only to find that most of the lifeboats had already been launched. The crew members who died in the disaster represented a cross-section of working-class Britain. Firemen and coal trimmers, stewards and cooks, deckhands and engineers, these men formed the backbone of the ship's operations. Many of them were from Southampton, and their loss left that city devastated. More than 500 households lost family members, and some streets had scarcely a house untouched by grief. The Titanic disaster was not merely a tragedy of the rich and famous, but a catastrophe that struck hardest at the ordinary families whose breadwinners had shipped aboard the greatest vessel in the world. The women of the Titanic also deserve particular attention. The principle of women and children first, while honored in the breach as well as the observance, did result in a much higher survival rate for women than for men. But this survival came at a terrible cost for many. Women who were separated from husbands, fathers, and sons faced the rest of their lives knowing that their loved ones had perished in the freezing water. Some never recovered from the trauma. Others channeled their grief into advocacy for maritime safety or charitable work for the families of those who had been lost. The children who survived the Titanic grew up under the shadow of the disaster. Many had lost fathers or older brothers in the sinking. Some had witnessed scenes of horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The youngest survivors, like Milvina Dean, had no memory of the events themselves but lived with the knowledge that they had been touched by one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. The heroes of the Titanic are remembered in memorials around the world. The engineers, who stayed at their posts to the end, are honored in Southampton and Liverpool. The musicians are commemorated in their hometowns and in a collective memorial. Captain Smith has a statue in Lichfield, the cathedral city near his birthplace. Thomas Andrews is remembered in Belfast, the city where he built the ship that would become his tomb. The Marconi operators are honored for their tireless efforts to summon help. The villains, if they can be called that, are less clearly defined. J. Bruce Ismay lived out his life under a cloud of suspicion, though he behaved no worse than many other men who survived. Captain Lord of the Californian protested his innocence until his death in 1962, and his supporters continue to argue his case. The Board of Trade officials who approved inadequate lifeboat regulations, the officers who launched boats half empty, the lookouts who may or may not have had binoculars, all bear some share of responsibility for a disaster that was ultimately the product of many failures rather than any single cause. The Titanic reminds us of our vulnerability in the face of nature's power. The sea does not care about human ambitions or human achievements. It does not respect wealth or status, does not honor our technology or our confidence. The ice that destroyed the Titanic had been floating on the ocean for thousands of years before it drifted into the shipping lanes, indifferent to the great ship that happened to be passing. And yet the story of the Titanic is not ultimately a story of despair. It is a story of courage and sacrifice, of men and women who faced death with dignity and who thought of others before themselves. It is a story of survival and resilience, of people who emerged from the most terrifying experience imaginable and went on to live full lives. It is a story of reform and improvement, of lessons learned and changes made that have saved countless lives in the century since. The Titanic lies 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic, her bow pointed toward a destination she will never reach. The passengers and crew who died with her lie scattered across the debris field, their remains long since returned to the elements from which they came. The ship that was called Unsinkable has been on the bottom of the ocean for more than 112 years, far longer than she ever floated on its surface. But in our memories and our imagination, the Titanic still sails. She departs Southampton on a spring morning, her lights blazing, her passengers waving to the crowds on shore. She steams across the Atlantic under a canopy of stars, her engines thrumming, her passengers dining and dancing and dreaming of the lives that await them on the other side. She is frozen in that moment of departure, eternally setting out on a voyage that will never end. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can hear the distant sound of her engines, the gentle hum of a great ship making her way across the sea. Perhaps you can imagine the lights reflected on the calm water, the stars spread across the sky, the vast and beautiful and terrible ocean stretching away in all directions. The Titanic sailed into history on a night much like this one, calm and quiet and full of possibilities. She carried with her the dreams of an age, the ambitions of a civilization, the hopes and fears of more than 2,000 souls. She was the greatest ship the world had ever seen, and she will never be forgotten. Rest now, and let the gentle rhythm of the waves carry you toward morning. The ocean keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its promises. And somewhere in the darkness of the deep, the Titanic waits, a monument to all that we have been and all that we might become. Thank you for joining us on this voyage through history. If you found this journey peaceful, please consider liking and subscribing to Sleep Orion. Your support allows us to continue creating content that helps you relax and learn as you drift off to sleep. Until next time, may your dreams be calm, your rest be deep, and your voyages carry you safely to whatever shores you seek. Good night, and sleep well.